Mr. Yang, help us to understand how could the terrorists and terrorist groups been using the internet so well, quote unquote, to lure young people into Syria and other areas of the world to fight for them?
I think some people use the word sophisticated measures of terrorism group to rescue some young people to join them. But for me, I think what sophisticated measures means that they use some attractive measures to attract young generations. For example, we know we're talking about Twitter and YouTube, something like that. The social media is attract a lot of young people join that. And the terrorism, they know how to make use of that. Sometimes they don't use a very, how to say, it's a very deadline, something like that, and very tough words. They use some soft measures. For example, last year, the ISO published, they use the word internet magazine. So in the internet magazines, they use the word, it's not the Muslim words. They use some Christian words, use a hawk ox. They mean that ISO is the ark, and the world is in the flood. So they attract a lot of Western countries' young people to thinking that they will go to the Syria and Iraq to find the ark. So they make use of that. That's some very special propaganda moment.
Well, I think there can be different areas when we talk about the terrorism online. One is technology, the application of technology. The other is content, how they lure the people, their propaganda strategies. And the third is, of course, how the world has been fighting against online terrorism. And of course, the latter is how the world has been cooperating with one another. So let's handle some of these one by one. You talk about the content, let's talk about the content. First of all, there are different terrorist groups that are advocating different kinds of propaganda. For example, IS, it is talking about a quote-unquote state governed by Sharia, which is extreme Islamic law. And then Al-Qaeda is different kinds of terrorist groups, is talking about jihad against quote-unquote the crusaders, mainly the West. So you see different strategies and propaganda ideas coming from different terrorist groups. Have the world come to realize that they have to come with different kinds of strategies to counter these different kinds of propaganda ideas coming from various different terrorist groups?
For me, I think that's a so comprehensive conflict for different terrorism groups use the internet. And first, they have some linkage, because some people say that Al-Qaeda is the founder of cyber terrorism, because in the early of 1980s, the founder of Al-Qaeda found the importance of the internet. They use the word the media. They said they must make use of the media to attract young generation, something like that. And for ISIL, they have some linkage with Al-Qaeda, because not only on the internet, also because there are some social linkage with that.
Right.
But now they found that they want to make use some new contents. The new content is maybe some different from the old generation, like Al-Qaeda, something like that. They want to attract the young generations in different way.
So my question is whether we have counterpoints against them, even only on the contents side.
And two countermeasures we can carry out. The first one is just to take down some contents, radical or extremism contents. That is a very simple one. The second, some people say it called the communities measures, which means that people will involve in the process, joined with law enforcement unit. For example, in UK, and they have a very special project, attract some family of the radicalist young people and something like that. They use the word referral, means transfer from one hospital to another hospital. That is maybe from the bad and radical hospital to the normal hospital. And they found that the family communities gave a lot of support for make the countermeasures for internet.
I see, that's one of those examples. When it comes to the radicals and radicalizing the young people, European Parliament just this week voted for a report which is forcing internet companies and organizations running internet content to take down contents that are supposed to be related to terrorism or indicating indicating specific content that can be related to terrorism. However, that goes against the European Commission's idea originally to have voluntary actions rather than enforcement of actions for these companies and organizations. What do you make of this recent development?
I think it's very difficult for European countries to carry out that policy. In the previous years, the agencies on human rights, privacy, something like that, they don't agree publicly to make some content in the cyberspace for terrorism. And they just say, okay, contents belong to the flow of information is freedom.
Right.
One can be regarded as one freedom. But this time, I think, because of the challenge, not come from Paris attack, but also in recent years, we found that ISO and some other terrorism groups have made use of the internet as a tools for their propaganda. So that's EU countries, especially EU Commission, want to show their
EU
attitude.
Parliament, rather,
yeah.
the European Parliament.
But vulnerable means that they have no, how say, it's a top policy.
Well,
No,
I mean,
decided by
European
different-
Parliament, they could have certain kinds of preferences. Well, national governments, whether they're going to implement it or not, that's another question. And whether the EU Commission would follow what the EU Parliament has suggested, that's also another question. But having said that, though, what do you think about this balance now between protection of human rights and online content freedom vis-a-vis so-called fights against terrorism?
Because counterterrorism issues is always found the balance point between the protection of human rights and the crackdown on terrorists. And how could we find the balance point? They're saying that trust but verified, which means that we can trust each other, we trust people, trust the human rights, trust the information flow of freedom. But we have to make some, not consensus, something like that. Verify means that the law enforcement have to know what is going on in the cyberspace.
But there are so many concepts that are not clearly defined at this moment. For example, whether everybody has agreed already on one version of what terrorism is, because there are debates among governments and pointing fingers at one another about whether they're fighting terrorism or they're fighting for their own national government agenda. That's one thing. And the other thing is who is going to define whether something belongs to terrorism contents or not, and who is going to have the power to take them off or put them on. So these are all questions that urgently needs to be defined, otherwise things can spill out of control, whether it's about taking them down or putting them on. So Mr. Yang, do you think there are international mechanisms or discussions, at least among professionals, doing exactly in that direction?
I think that the United Nations have talking about that. For example, in 2013, the UN Assembly has passed a resolution say that international communities pay some concerns for the maybe in the new area, the terrorists make use of the ICT to make some terrorism operations, something like that. But the challenge is how to define our definition of the cyber terrorism.
Exactly.
Because in the virtual world, in the real world, we can think that if you make attack, that belongs to the terrorist attack. But in the cyber space, it's very difficult to make the difference.
For example, what is a verbal threat and what is going to be the potential to carry out actions related to the verbal
some
threat?
Some people maybe just make some chatting or some with other people. They're talking about some maybe radical words, but it's very difficult for law enforcement unit to make the definition of make the category of terrorism, or maybe it's for radicalization, or just talking something.
Right, that's one of the difficulties. The other thing you mentioned, which is interesting, whether we're going to have quote-unquote people's war against the terror online. We see some of the so-called hackers groups, they volunteer to do that. For example, we have even some specific groups such as the Ghost Security and Anonymous. They are claiming they're waging the wars against terrorism in the cyberspace, taking down ISO Twitter account for 5,000 and even more. But will they be effective, do you think, in real sense? And once again, who is governing them? And whether the information they are providing are accurate or not, or whether they are violating somebody else's rights of communication and freedom of speech.
For me, I don't think they are effective.
Why not?
And maybe in the future they will make some challenge for the international communities of counterterrorism issues.
But you just said, Mr. Yang, that the community need to be geared up in order to fight against them. So these are the hackers, they're fighting against them, at least they say.
And anonymous groups, they are not belong to the communities. They are hackers group. They're not only against terrorists, they're also against some governments or website, even some communist website. So if they can do anything, maybe they shut down some websites, they said they belong to terrorists, but who gives them the authorities to give the attack on some website? So that's a challenge. So for me, I think maybe at the beginning they can do something, but in the future, how could we integrate them into the real international or social communities?
And the other thing it's also important, it has to do with the job that we are having right here, Mr. Yang, which is the media. Of course, we've been hearing from media, especially TV and some of the traditional media such as newspapers, about certain messages advocated by the terrorists on their website or through their Twitter accounts and being reported directly to the public. On the one hand, the public does have the necessity to have access to information. On the other hand, there's also debate about whether this is too much for the public to know, whether it is being used by the terrorists to spread their messages around or their threats around. What do you make of this?
For me, I don't think that the terrorism information is, natural for people to know that, because they are not belong to the normal information. They can be regarded as one act or maybe one change of terrorism attack. If we read that, it means that we give some support for the publication.
But the public do not need to have the information to the possible threat that they're supposed to have?
If something is a bad thing, do you think that people will read it? Because there are only international law and international norms that if something is maybe related to racism and terrorism, that will be banned or taboo by the society, by the world. So I don't think it can be regarded as a normal information, something like that, because of the different opinions, we can read that. But it's very dangerous, because according to some story happened in the United States, we can find at the beginning, the parents don't believe it's so dangerous for their children to read that. But after 1 year, they found their children joined the jihad movement. So they said we have to take down and shut down the information to my family, to my communities.
And finally, before we go, some interesting phenomenon and worrisome phenomenon. The terrorist groups and terrorists individually are operating their own personal Twitter account or social media account in order to advocate their ideas. And that could be enormous amount that we are talking about, because one could have enormous amount of different kinds of accounts. So how could that be tackled in a way? Because it's about a person-to-person communication almost. And they can use that in a very personal way to lure young people to join what they call their cause. What do you think can be the solutions for this?
I think solutions is very difficult. It's not only they talk by some Twitter or something like that. We found that in Paris case, they use a PS4, the player station 4. That means they could use some new kind of, not media, not social media, it's a communication or ICT. That's a challenge, because we couldn't really find what kind of communication channel is. It's not one person to another person, P2P.
Right.
It may be one person to a lot of people, even to millions of people. For example, Twitter. Some people found that last year, there are about 40,000 supporters for ISIS found in Twitter. So that 400 is not enough. They found that there's like a net of trees, that 40,000 means maybe doubled and maybe twins.
So it's getting ever complicated. It's extremely important as a result to address the root cause of terrorism rather than just cure the symptoms that's leading to the spread of terrorism around the world. Well, on that point, I want to thank you, Mr. Yang Mingjie from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, for being with us. Thank you so much, sir.